The US House votes to make Washington, D.C. a state, but the historic step is unlikely to progress.
For the first time in history, the US House of Representatives has voted to declare Washington, D.C. America's 51st state. The vote, along largely party lines, comes as the idea of making the city a state gathered steam in the wake of the protests against George Floyd's death. Washington's 700,000 residents don't have representatives in either the House or the Senate, which critics say is unfair.
For the first time in history, the US House of Representatives has approved a measure to make Washington, D.C. the country's 51st state. D.C. stands for District of Columbia. It has a population of over 700,000 people. That's larger than the populations of several states. But residents have no voting representation in Congress. In the House of Representatives, the district is represented by a sole delegate who's not allowed to vote on the floor. And D.C. residents have no representation whatsoever in the 100-member Senate. Despite the vote in the House, the proposal is almost certain to fail in the Senate. Professor Rickman is an American political historian, academic and author who lives and works in Washington, D.C. He explains why is it that Washington currently has no representation in the Congress or the Senate.
The District of Columbia was not ever a state. It was a created region to be the nation's capital in the 1790s when there wasn't yet a permanent capital and nobody wanted to go to one of the big established cities because that would favor one area over another. And it was totally under the control of the federal government. It wasn't until 1961 that by constitutional amendment, the people of the District of Columbia got to vote in presidential elections. But as you mentioned, they have no senator, they have no member of Congress except a shadow representative with no voting rights.
So does the vote in the House of Representatives mean that Washington, D.C. might be on the road to statehood, or what about the Senate? What about the president?
Well, here's the thing. This is only the second time we've had a vote, and it was defeated handily way back in the early 1990s. Now it passed by quite a large majority with only one Democrat voting against it. Obviously, the Grim Reaper, as he's known, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, is going to let this die in the Senate, just as he let Barack Obama's appointment for the Supreme Court of Merrick Garland die. But we have an election coming up, and there is at least a chance that the Democrats could win the presidency. They're almost certain to hold on to the House, and they could take back the Senate, which could open a door to D.C. statehood because Democrats so overwhelmingly favor it.
If not Washington, D.C. as a new state, what about Puerto Rico?
Well, that would be a possibility as well. I think you might be able to muster Democratic votes. Look, Republicans don't want anything to do with D.C. or Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico, of course, is Hispanic, although they're all U.S. citizens. They don't have statehood, and D.C. is heavily majority-minority. One opponent of D.C. statehood, without explicitly saying it, drew an invidious comparison between D.C. and Wyoming, which is over 80% white. But if you get a big enough Democratic majority, it's certainly possible. It does not require a constitutional amendment.